minority among scientists, but it would be interesting to find out. Richard Dawkins, for example, says in The God Delusion, perhaps there are some genuinely profound and meaningful questions that are forever beyond the reach of science. He's certainly not alone in taking that view. What kinds of questions might they be? Well, there's a huge variety, but Peter looked briefly at why is there anything at all, why is there something rather than nothing. Can science answer that question? Well, scientists will certainly point to the Big Bang, but then we want to know, well, why was there a bang rather than no bang? And if they say, well, there are certain conditions which made a Big Bang likely or probable, then we will ask, well, what explains why those conditions were in place, and so on. There appears to be a problem so far as scientific explanation is concerned, because when scientists explain things, they typically appeal to, say, laws of nature or causes in order to provide the explanation, a sort of a standard model of scientific explanation, the covering model of scientific explanation developed by Hempel, says that when scientists explain things, what they do is they appeal to a law of nature. So if you want to know why the water froze in the pipes last Tuesday, the explanation is the temperature of the water in the pipes last Tuesday fell below 0 degrees centigrade, water freezes below 0 degrees centigrade, therefore the water froze in the pipes last Tuesday. So that's an explanation. It appeals to a law of nature. It may be that laws of nature can themselves be in turn explained by deeper, more fundamental laws of nature. But if we're going to reach a point where science is going to run out of steam in terms of explaining things, there will be certain basic fundamental laws, presumably, in which certainly that model of scientific explanation cannot be applied, necessarily cannot be applied. So if that's true, and it certainly on the face of it looks like it might be true, then it might be the case that this particular question cannot receive a scientific explanation. It may be in principle impossible for science to answer the question. Having said that, well, I'll come back to that question. But then now let's look at another question, perhaps that science can't answer. Perhaps the most cliched example is moral questions. Scientists can establish what is the case. They can accurately describe how our universe is, on what principles it operates. They can make technologies available that allow us to do certain things, such as design babies and so on. But when it comes to the question of whether we ought or ought not to do something, it looks as if science is by itself is necessarily incapable of answering those kinds of questions for us. David Hume puts it like this: science deals with the is facts, the facts about what is the case, and science is very, very good at establishing those kinds of facts. But moral questions are questions about what we ought or ought not to do. They are, if you like, questions about the ought facts. And there is a problem about how you could justify an ought conclusion relying solely on is premises. You just can't do that. Well, certainly on the face of it, there's a very significant problem there about how you could justify a moral position. You may be able to explain why people make the moral choices that they do. You may be able to explain causally, using science, why they have the moral intuitions that they do, why they do the terrible things that they do. All of this is the province of science. But why it is wrong, well, that's a different. Now we're in the realm of ought, and there it looks as if empirical sciences are going to be in trouble. So I've just given you two classic examples of the kind of questions that on the face of it, empirical sciences, at the very least, they're going to struggle with, and on the face of it, it looks as if it is in principle impossible for those kind of sciences to answer those questions. So that was the first thing I wanted to do briefly. And I should point out that Richard, in his book, The God Delusion, does actually say that we can all agree that science's entitlement to advise us on moral values is problematic, to say the least. So again, I think Richard backs away from that extreme scientism position, which says that every decent question worth considering, well, that's a question that the empirical science is going to be able to answer for us. So it's a pretty extreme view, I think, that Peter is defending here, which is not to say that it's wrong. It's pretty okay. The other thing I want to do, how are we doing for time? I'm okay. Yeah. It seems to me that there are also this is where perhaps I'm defending philosophy a bit more, there are non-scientific ways of answering questions. Science is very good at answering questions, but sometimes you can answer a question without doing any empirical science. Here are two illustrations. First of all, well, supposing somebody comes back from an expedition and they say, it's extraordinary, I discovered something quite amazing, a four-sided triangle. Would we immediately find funds to put together an expedition to go out and verify that in fact this discovery had taken place? Of course we wouldn't, because we could know just by thinking about it that there ain't no such triangle out there. Peter was rather disparaging about what we could establish just by thinking about it. Well, we could save ourselves a lot of money looking for the four-sided triangle for a start. We can know just by thinking about it that it's not out there. That's because there's a conceptual problem with the suggestion that there are four-sided triangles out there. If you're claiming that it's a very obvious conceptual problem in this case. It's clear that there's a formal contradiction involved there. It can't be both a three-sided figure and also a four-sided figure. It can't be both of those things simultaneously. So we can know that it's not worth bothering to look for one. Now it may be that there are other things that we can establish that are perhaps rather less obvious by doing a little bit of conceptual analysis, a little bit of unpacking of concepts, a little bit of thinking things through. And it seems to me that there are such things. I mean, good questions worth considering, for example. Why is it that mirrors reverse left to right and not top to bottom? I mean, Plato thought about that. It's a really, really tricky question, actually. And I think that at root, it's not a scientific question. Even when you've got all the scientific information in about exactly what's going on with light, the way it's being reflected and so on, the fact is you're still left just as baffled as you were at the beginning. It's a conceptual puzzle, and you need to reflect on the concepts of left, right, top, bottom, up, down, and so on, in order to finally realise what the solution is. It's not a scientific puzzle. But of course, many scientists will say, oh, I can solve that for you. That's easy. I'm a scientist. I can solve every problem. If this is a genuine problem, I'll solve that for you, no problem. But it's not. I don't think it's actually a scientific problem at all. I think it's a conceptual problem. I suspect that many other problems in philosophy are essentially conceptual problems. The mind-body problem. Scientists will no doubt be able to establish perhaps a correlation between something going on in your brain, something going on in your mind. So they're identical then. Well, no. Not if there are conceptual problems so far as actually identifying those two things. And if there are such conceptual problems, you're going to need to get over them. You're going to need to do conceptual engineering, and that's what philosophers do, conceptual engineering, if you like. So it seems to me that there is still quite a lot of work, potentially, for conceptual engineers or philosophers to do, which is not yet to say that philosophy is in the business of discovering how reality is. I don't think it is, but it is in the business of conceptual clarification, also spotting a bad argument. We're pretty good at that, finding the flaws in a piece of logical reasoning. Again, that's a skill that we have developed. We're pretty good at it, not necessarily perfect at it, but it's the kind of thing that philosophers tend to be quite good at, and they can quite often spot the philosophical flaws in a scientist's argument straight away. But of course the scientist will just say, well, don't be ridiculous. I mean, there's no value to philosophy, there's no point in my thinking about any of that, because science has all of the answers. It tends to be very dismissive when philosophers apply those kinds of tools to arguments that are, in essence, actually philosophical. So there's some value, perhaps, in philosophy. It also seems to me that there's another kind of job that not philosophers could do, but that we've been doing long before the discovery of the scientific method, which I take it is only around about 400 or 500 years old. It was developed by people like Francis Bacon, 17th, 18th centuries. Long before that, we were doing things like this. Peter tells me he's got a cat stuffed up his shirt. I go over and have a good old feel. I don't hear any meows, and I conclude he's lying. There ain't no cat stuffed up his shirt. I can pretty conclusively refute his claim that he's got a cat stuffed up his shirt. When I do that, I mean, that's empirical. It's based on observation. Is it science? Is that science? I mean, it's certainly not an application of the scientific method as has been developed over the last 400, 500 years. Now, it depends what you mean by science, maybe. But it certainly sounds odd to my ears to say that I'm doing science when I do that, in the same way as it sounds odd to me to say that I'm doing science if somebody says, oh, it's 8 o'clock and I say, no, but the sun's still up. Am I doing science? Or no? No, this is just the ordinary common or garden refutation of the position, empirically based, that people have engaged in for literally thousands of years, long before the development of the scientific method. And they are very, very effective. They can be very, very effective, those kinds of refutation. So there is the possibility that we might establish all sorts of things using those kinds of arguments, including claims about the supernatural. It seems to me, actually, just to finish off my final point, I've been going on too long, so I'll stop shortly. It seems to me that when people discuss the supernatural, they very often do this. They draw a veil across reality and they say, well, this is your half, Mr. Scientist, but you need to remember that there are more things in heaven and hell that are dreamt of in your philosophy, and behind the veil, I've got my stuff, which is some fairies, some goblins, a couple of gods, and psychic powers. And you have to stop here, and you can't apply your scientific method to what lies behind the veil. Now, actually, if what's claimed about what's behind the veil has empirically observable consequences, we certainly can refute claims about what's behind the veil. So it seems to me, for example, that claims about God are potentially refutable without using science whatsoever. So, for example, there may be some conceptual problem with the very notion of God, which philosophers could spell out. In fact, they have. They've done it. There are problems with the notion of God which reveal that when you unpack the notion, particularly if you're thinking about, for example, a non-temporal agency, right? If you unpack that notion, you find the whole thing falls apart. It doesn't work conceptually. So you don't need an empirical refutation of belief in God. You can just do the work conceptually, and that will have been a philosophical and devastating refutation of belief in God. You could also do this. You could just look out of the window and establish that there's an enormous amount of good stuff in the universe. Tons and tons of it. Love, laughter and rainbows. There's bad stuff too, but there's a lot of good stuff out there. So now supposing somebody says to me that behind the veil, back here, they've got a God who is, the creator God who is all-powerful, all-knowing and supremely evil. This is the creation of an infinitely malevolent being. I can just look out the window and go, no, it ain't. I mean, just take a look. Just spend 5 minutes and you'll see abundant empirical evidence that there's no such being behind the screen. I don't know what is behind the screen necessarily, but I can be pretty sure that that isn't behind the screen, because there are going to be consequences of there being a being like that, and the world just wouldn't look like this. Now, if you can show that that belief is false that easily on the basis of just a little bit of empirical investigation, not very much, it's hardly science, is it? Then I don't see why you couldn't, in the same way, establish that there ain't no good God back there either. It's just too much bad stuff in the world. And that's not a scientific refutation, that's more like checking there's no cat up Peter's shirt.
So you can stand up.
Oh, okay. That was much too long, I apologise.
Yeah, it was. What a litany of pessimism that was. I mean, you started off, your first 10 minutes was about saying that there are questions that we cannot approach.
Like, there may be, yeah.
Yeah, like the origin of the universe. That's a pessimistic view. You said that we can't attack through science questions of morality, or all questions. That's a pessimistic view as well. I think the approach to the first sort of question is through cosmology, physics, astronomy, mathematics. The approach to the second sort of question is through ethology, through evolution, through psychology, through anthropology. And both those can be brought to bear on these two seriously difficult questions. And to say that science cannot tread in these waters, I think is just sort of pessimistic step too far.
Right. So we respond straight away to that?
Yeah.
Well, I do think that science has something to say.